Please subscribe to this channel so that we are more enthusiastic in providing the best video for you. Chapter 441. His Unrivaled Prestige. You think that I didn't know how loyal the 4 Jun generals were? I know it better than anyone else. These kinds of generals are any ruler's dream, but they're also a nightmare. And I'm no exception either. We had acquired huge advantages when we were fighting the Xi and the Yutang empires. We could have stormed their capitals at any time as long as I or Jun Wuhui wanted it. The war had already reached its final moments. But I let the dream of a unified land under me go in exchange of defeat, and paid with thousands of casualties. I gave up the lives of Jun Wuhui and Jun Wumeng in those battles to maintain the equilibrium of the tripartite. Do you think that my heart doesn't feel pain inside? I'm even more confused in that case. Why did you let go of the opportunity of a unified the land? Not only did you let that slip, but you were also content to be defeated? Did you lose your mind or something? The Empress was truly puzzled. It was my dream to unify the land under my rule. It was my greatest and most cherished dream besides making you my wife. But what would have happened after I had unified the entire land? What could I have rewarded the Jun family with after they had used their power to unify the land? The only reward you can give to someone with such martial service is to make them king. However, the Jun family already had a frightening amount of fiefdom. And they also had considerable military strength on top of that. This was in addition to their insanely powerful influence throughout the empire. This was equal to creating the most powerful enemy one could have. This was equal to me getting stuck on a road with no exit. And the Jun family would have revolted if I wouldn't have rewarded them. You didn't let them win because you couldn't reward them? These are extremely ridiculous arguments. The Empress was stunned at first. However, she eventually smiled in mockery. Extremely ridiculous, right? Let me tell you that this wasn't ridiculous. There's nothing ridiculous about it. It isn't ridiculous at all. Do you know that generals need official authorization for sending troops? And the generals have only half of the authorization on their hands. The other half stays with me. And one can only mobilize troops after the two halves are joined together. But did you know what happened at that time? The 4 Jun generals didn't need any authorization to mobilize the troops. They didn't need it to mobilize the troops. The army would plainly follow their orders. Do you know what that meant? I had gone to see off Jun Wuhui when he had led an army of 800,000 men 12 years ago. They were as calm and quiet as evil spirits while I was addressing them at the grounds. But they started to cheer at his signal after I finished. In fact, they did so in coordinated unison. Do you understand? The Emperor's face had become twisted, and he looked ashamed. I don't understand. The Empress shook her head. Their coordinated cheering was rehearsed in advance. And then, everything became quiet after they had stopped cheering. 800,000 men stood there. And yet there was pin-drop silence. Do you know what this means? The Emperor gnashed his teeth as he spoke. Doesn't that mean that the discipline of the troops was very strict under Jun Wuhui? You should be happy. Are you saying that you were mad because hundreds of thousands of troops stayed in strict discipline? The Queen was even more confused. Do you still not understand what I mean? Do you know what happened when I gave Jun Wuhui my half of the authorization? The muscles on His Majesty's face pulsated. His expression was one of humiliation. The army suddenly started to cheer for him. Flags were waved in the air. And the warhorses neighed. It seemed that the world would turn on its head, and the mountains would be devoured by tsunamis, and heaven and earth would become pale. And that continued for a long time. The golden tripod I stood in front of vibrated and fell because of the vibrations from their cheering. I was standing on the podium, and I saw the eyes of those 800,000 men as they turned towards Jun Wuhui with a fanatical zeal. Each one of their cold weapons had been raised to fill the sky. And Jun Wuhui only made one action during their spell of enthusiasm, and the entire army quieted down in an instant. In fact, there was pin-drop silence. Then, he took the pendant of authorization and held it above. He then turned to the army and looked at them. His eyes swept over the troops, and not one soldier moved from their place. Do you know that this wasn't even intentional on their part? Then, he turned around to face me, raised the pendant, drew his sword, and started to take an oath. But the cheers of those 800,000 men were seemingly been cut off by a sword the moment he turned towards them after the oath. In fact, there was complete silence. It was quiet. One could have clearly heard the sound of a water droplet falling to the ground. The dust was still covering the air, yet everything was still on the ground. He didn't need to draw his sword, he didn't need to make a gesture, he had only turned around. One careless look from him, and those 800,000 men had become silent at once. The great and awe-inspiring Jun Wuhui. The great awe and inspiring white general, the hearts of the Empress and Princess Ling Meng shook as they listened to this. They could imagine that spectacular scene. The two could imagine the unrivaled greatness of Jun Wuhui. And they couldn't help their spirits from becoming excited and fascinated. I knew you'd think like that. You're a pair of idiots, the Emperor furiously continued. I was also there at that scene. Where did that place my position? Where does it place our prestige if the soldiers cheered 100 times more for Jun Wuhui than they cheered for me? I felt that I would see 800,000 dead bodies lying in an ordered formation if Jun Wuhui were to order them to commit suicide. The imperial palace would have probably been reduced to rubbles if Jun Wuhui had given them an order to lay siege to our palace. He needn't even have given the order, a tiny movement, a careless look, and it would have become our reality. The Empress drew a long breath. She had finally understood where the Emperor's misgivings were coming from. The extent of Jun Wuhui's influence was astonishing. His strength was indeed awe-inspiring. However, it was a threat to the Emperor's life. And things would have remained as such until he had died. Do you understand now? The Emperor smiled bitterly. The Jun family had over 1.5 million men under them. And the Dugu family's Dugu Wudi worshipped Jun Wuhui. In fact, that Dugu would have followed him blindly. So, they would have combined to have around 1.8 million troops once Dugu Wudi's forces were added to the Jun families. Moreover, the Jun family had people in high places within the city's defense, and in even higher rankings in the guards. In fact, they were around 200,000 in total. And the defensive forces also had around 30,000 Jun troops in their ranks. However, the remaining of the nation only had a combined strength of 600,000. That means that the Jun family's strength had surpassed 2 million in total. Moreover, most of them were elite troops who had experienced all kinds of battles. Those who remained behind were inferior. This means that we could only muster 600,000 amateur troops if we were to dispatch an army. And that is also an optimistic estimate. How do you expect me to be at ease in such a situation? How could I have been at ease? Would you have been at ease if it were you? How could I not know that the Jun family is a good and loyal family? How could I not know that they were so loyal that they could never even think about rebelling? That they would never revolt? But I still had to do it, even if I knew that the Jun family would never rebel. In fact, I had no choice but to do it. The emperor frowned in pain. Because I am the emperor. And because I can't stand this kind of a threat. No. I don't think that any emperor can ever stand such a thing. Would any emperor have stood and watched such a thing? He had lost the power to mobilize his own troops. However, the 4 Jun generals didn't need any approvals to mobilize the troops. This means that there could have been a transition of power at any time, or any place. The Jun family may not have wanted to rebel, and they may not have thought of a transition of power. But it doesn't mean that others wouldn't have thought like that either. Do you know that my great ancestor's family was also thought to be loyal during his rise? They had supported the Tian dynasty and had formed its strongest base. But it was too easy for someone to make him rebel. He only needed one mutiny to make the new emperor. He was pushed on a road from which he couldn't turn back and became the ruler. I've learned that from my predecessors. So, do you still think that I'm under naive delusions? Do you wish for me to sit and wait for death? His Majesty's voice was full of grief. Don't you know about this matter as a Murong family descendant? Don't you know about Murong Qianqiu? The Tian dynasty was the incomparably splendid predecessor of the Tian Xiang dynasty. The ancestor of the Yang family had a brilliant military career in those days. In fact, it was similar to the frightening career of Jun Wuhui's. The Yang family's ancestor had been triumphant in every battle. And he was equally loyal to his king as well. But Murong Qianqiu was one of the generals under him. And the Murong family's ancestor had persuaded him to commit the unbelievable rebellion. Consequently, they had led the troops in a night attack and had executed the Tian dynasty's king and the crown prince as well. There was no way to retreat from that unstable massacre. And the Tian Xiang Empire of present day had gradually emerged from a mountain of corpses and an ocean of blood. In other words, a big mutiny had led to the rise of the current-day Tian Xiang Empire. The assist was provided by the Murong family of that time. And this had led to the Murong family's current position in the latter empire. There was only one Murong Qianqiu in the days of the great ancestor. But can you guess how many Murong Qianqiu were present under the 4 Jun generals? Do you know how many men might have tried to facilitate something like that against us? More importantly, do you know how much more fanatical they were? I'll tell you. There were at least 20 of these men who could have made the Jun family act recklessly. And the Tian Xiang Empire would have been done for even if one of them would have stood up. Do you understand it now? Your questions were those of naive clemency. The emperor snarled in a low voice. However, his voice was filled with pain and helplessness. Jun Wuhui was such a talented general. Any ruler would have wanted him to command his troops and fight wars to expand their boundaries. However, I had to exert the entirety of my strength in attempts to get him killed by any means. Do you know how much pain I felt? I am an emperor. How can I not wish to conquer the lands? I'd be king of all the skies, all the land, and all the shores. One order and the whole world would have shuddered. One word, and the whole world would have shuddered. But have you ever thought that such power and influence was given to the Jun family by your hands alone? How could it have reached such a level if you hadn't given them that authority back then? Moroing Xiao stopped even though she had only spoken half of it. Please subscribe to this channel so that we are more enthusiastic in providing the best video for you. Chapter 442. Conscience. Not give them authority. Right? Right? The Tian Xiang Empire was under assault from all sides in those days. Jun Tian had been stabbed and wounded. So, he couldn't take charge of the military matters anymore. Du Zhongheng is a brave man, but he wasn't suitable for that situation. The Yutang Empire had attacked the east with 600,000 men. The Xinxia Empire had attacked with 500,000 men from the west like lightning. Furthermore, the Ling Xiao Empire had attacked with 400,000 men from the southeast, and the Grassland King had attacked with 400,000 cavalrymen from the north. Our empire had been besieged from all sides. I gave Jun Wuhui an order to take 200,000 men. He was supposed to take on Yutang's 600,000 in the east, and the Ling Zhao's 400,000 in the southeast. It was 200,000 against 1,000,000. Jun Wu Meng and Jun Wu Yi were to face those grassland wolves in the north, and Duge Wu Di and Murong Feng Yun were sent with 200,000 to face the 500,000 of the Xinxia Empire in the west. Such a division of troops had required us to even send most of the soldiers from the defensive formations. And this had left us with less 10,000 men to guard the capital. Everyone had believed that the Tian Xiang Empire was done for. And I was no exception. There was a wide difference in strength. In fact, it was like a mantis trying to stop chariots that were incoming from all sides. Moreover, the mantis was sitting on its deathbed. But who would have thought that Jun Wuhui would have such superhuman military talent? He took the lead on the field before the enemy could act, and made a move before them. He then burned the Yutang's forces in 3 months in midwinter. 7,000 miles of mountainous forests were burned down. In fact, the biggest tree in those 7,000 miles of stretch is still no larger than a man's thighs. He then beat Ling Zhao's 400,000 men in 3 months as well. He went forward bravely, and took 19 cities in that campaign. Moreover, he even made use of the prisoners he had captured, and somehow increased his army's size to 800,000. Consequently, he annihilated Ling Zhao's forces, and destroyed their danger in the south. Then, he pounced on the Yutang forces at the border. The successive battles were won by systematic attacks. And the reputation of the Great White General never fell one notch. And Jun Wu Meng and Jun Wu Yi didn't wish to be left behind by their elder brother either. They fought the wolves of the grassland in the north. They turned a disadvantageous situation around, and made it an equal one with their systematic strategies. They eventually expelled him, and entered right into the prairie grasslands. And don't forget that Jun Wu Yi was only 19 at the time. But his clothes were already covered with many layers of blood. Blood flowed wherever he went, and heads rolled. They started calling him the Blood General due to his achievements. His murderous aura was the densest in the land. Jun Wu Meng was cold-hearted, and maintained strict discipline. He ran a very tightly functioning army. He rarely spoke, and his word was law. He moved swiftly and decisively, and slaughtered each captive in every fight. He didn't leave a single living soul behind. He was called the Bloody God of Battle. The population of the prairie grassland was reduced considerably, and it hasn't reinstated till this day. In fact, they don't dare to attack recklessly in the face of my imperial forces anymore. The fame of those 4 Jun generals spread everywhere after that. They had fought on all sides, and still hadn't lost. The Jun family's fighting prowess became increasingly well known. The fame of the White General, the Bloody God of Battle, and the Blood General started to resound everywhere. And I wasn't able to curtail their military power even after a few years had passed. The entire world knew of the 4 Jun family generals, but not many could remember the ruler of the Tian Xiang Empire. The Jun family could raise the entire country, or even areas thousands of miles beyond Tian Xiang. In fact, they could rally the entire world. His Majesty said this, and let out a long sigh. Tough situations bring out the heroes. These are truly wise words. The families in Tian Xiang were providing long memorial tablets to Jun Moxie in just 3.5 years. Jun Moxie and his brothers became living gods of war throughout the Xian continent. They were shrouded in eternal glory as they became legends. However, legends like these three men are three extremely sharp swords as far as I'm concerned. Moreover, they were swords which were hanging over my head. The entire country celebrated after the crisis ended. But our treasuries were exhausted, and the economy was growing with difficulty. However, the imperial troops were witnessing an unprecedented heyday. The empire's territory had also expanded to a brilliant degree. We looked boldly at the rest of the world, and no hero could dare to look us in the eye. The oceans became quiet for some time, and the foreign aggressions died down. But there was a crisis in my ear now. And it was arriving very quickly. I was sure that the one to sit on the throne during Tian Xiang's peaceful period was either Jun Tian or Jun Moxie. It certainly wasn't me. That's because Tian Xiang wouldn't necessarily be Tian Xiang when that time would arrive. Princess Ling Meng was burning with anger as she listened in from the side. Countless people had mentioned Jun Moxie's military successes to her. But her heart had been stirred upon listening to her high and mighty father speaking of the splendid glory of those days. He was such a heroic man. Jun Moxie. And Jun Moxie is the sole remaining descendant of this glorious and splendid hero. I understand, and even acknowledge your misgivings now. But your plans went beyond Jun Moxie, Jun Meng, and Jun Moxie. Why did they have to include Jun Mou and Jun Mo Cho? The Empress's voice belied some understanding. But she still wasn't completely clear. So, her voice was still sharp. They were only children at that time. Moreover, they were the sons of someone who had done excellent service for Tian Xiang. How could your heart and conscience endure that? Jun Mou and Jun Mo Cho were young, but they were already fledgling talented commanders. They had become popular within the ranks in a few battles alone, and their prestige had reached extremely great heights. What would have happened if such talented generals were to find out that I was the one who had planned to get their father and uncles killed? What would they have done to me? I had already turned my back on the Jun family once. So, why wouldn't I have done it again? I would renounce the entire world if we were in danger. In fact, there's no one that I wouldn't turn on. The emperor flashed a smile of gloom. Moreover, there were next to no hostilities around at this point of time. The Yutang and the Shenxia empires had been pushed back, and they were suing for peace. So, I was worried that there wouldn't be a fog of war anymore. Therefore, I took advantage of the fact that they still hadn't spread their wings properly. And I removed them. However, there was another reason. I had only given a slight nudge in getting those Jun family's members killed. But the ones to kill them were from the Silver Blizzard City. They were the Xiao family's people. Not me. What an excellent justification. You're truly shameless. The Empress sneered. But you still didn't let the Jun family go. You suppressed them further, even after you had done so many things. The only people who remained in a family that could have once shaken the heavens were an old man, a cripple, and a debauchee. But you still didn't let them off. Why's that? What great justification do you have for doing such a thing? Why? You're asking me why. The emperor's eyes had opened big and wide. He looked at her like she was some strange creature. You're still asking me this question? You still don't know? I really don't know. They were the family of a great general. Moreover, they were a family of heroes who had saved the Tian Xiang Empire and posed no challenge to you anymore. But you've suppressed them and made them suffer for so many years without ever stopping. I don't understand why you've been doing this. Is this the so-called heart of an emperor? The man doesn't bear you, but you bear the man? The empress's expression had become even colder. Because I'm also a man. Do you understand? The emperor snarled in a low voice. My conscience becomes uneasy every time I face Jun Tian. Then I'm filled with guilt. Do you understand guilt? I feel that I've let him down. I've let the entire Jun family down. So I feel pain and guilt every time I face him. But things would be better if all of them were dead. My guilt will vanish if they died. Do you understand this? I understand everything you've said. But couldn't I turn against the Jun family again if I had already done it once before? I was in danger with myself, my own heart. I had to live in this world. And who could have lived my actions? I killed my own benefactors. I killed the heroes of the empire. But I had to find some means to pacify my conscience. The empress remained silent. Then she started to mutter one thing in a loop. Conscience, 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 conscience explains everything. This is the first time I've heard this. Even you are a human? Even you have a conscience? This is nice to hear. She then chuckled and sneered before she spoke up. Then, why don't you continue to oppress the Jun family now? Why are you defending them this time? Hasn't your conscience been stirring your heart anymore? You've been oppressing them for such a long time. And you can finally exterminate them by using this depravity of Jun Moxie. Isn't this your cherished dream? So, what has made you change so much? It's because the Jun family. I don't understand it properly. I can't dare to rush in. Who is this powerful person that backs the Jun family? The emperor frowned in a dignified manner. There was an expression of slight confusion on his face. Will that person interfere if I try to exterminate the Jun family? The Donghua family had once thrown 300 heads inside the imperial palace to avenge Jun Wuhui's death. But they only had a suspicion on me back then. However, I don't even have the Silver City to use as pretense at this time. So, how can I annihilate the Jun family? So, you're afraid. And it's not because you care for them, the empress sneered. You had entrapped and slaughtered a loyal general because you were afraid. And you can't do anything now either. In fact, you can only compromise because you're afraid. Right? Compromise. How is this compromise? The emperor became enraged. Why are my actions always so unbearable to your eyes? Why can't you stand where I do and look at things from my point of view? Why can't you act as a ruler and weigh the matters of the world? The gaze of the emperor of the world is always shameless. The empress's face was cold. I admire your opinion on conscience. How thick a skin do you need to have such big conscience? I'm shocked at your amazing planning. And I truly admire how shameless your frame of mind is, and how you can keep calm. I particularly worship your emperor's aura. But I've seen the congealed ugliness of society now. Anyway, I'm quite tired now. So, can you see yourself out? I've always thought that you knew me well. But I've always been wrong. In fact, you don't know me at all, the emperor said sadly. Hundreds of people will die if the Jun family is exterminated. But how many millions will die if it's the Tian Xiang Empire in their place? The rise of a dynasty isn't about the emergence of a great general alone. But how can the sacrifice and helplessness of an emperor be measured with common sense? I can tolerate a ruler's ambition and ruthlessness. I can even bear his willingness to use both fair means and foul. I can also tolerate a ruler if he mercilessly slaughters everyone in the land to unify it under their command. But I don't care about a ruler who acts in a selfish, shameless, and vulgar manner. I don't care what he achieves. Such a ruler will be nothing more than trash in my eyes. In fact, he wouldn't be any different in my eyes even if he was an emperor for eternity. Please subscribe to this channel so that we are more enthusiastic in providing the best video for you. Chapter 443. Difficulties the entire journey. The Empress stared expressionless. Her expression was ice-cold as she spoke downheartedly. You've already said that I'm the person you love the most. You targeted the Yi family because of me. So, I was the goal when you talked of this. But this matter with the Jun family is because of your dark heart, especially the fact that you didn't let them off afterwards. I'm only a woman, and I can't do a thing. I've asked myself, and I genuinely can't do a thing. And I know that I won't have a chance to leave the palace since you've said these things to me today. Isn't that right? The Empress calmly raised her head. And she was still as calm when she looked at him. However, the Emperor didn't face her. You wouldn't have told me so much today otherwise. And then, I've gone to the Jun household so many times, haha. It's like you had suspected, it had never stopped. But let me warn you. The Empress raised her head, and a sharp light radiated around her eyes. The air also became a little colder as she said, Yi Gu Han. The Emperor's body trembled. He had finally realized why the Empress was responding to him that day. It was because Yi Gu Han was sheltered in the Jun household at this time. I hope that you don't harm him. He's crippled. He doesn't have anything. He already had nothing before. But he's only surviving on Xian's strength now. The Empress' tone was hollow as she looked at that gorgeous palace with an empty expression. She seemed lifeless. But he still has you. He has your heart. The Emperor let out a mind-tearing and lung-splitting roar. My heart had died 18 years ago. The Empress replied dully. I don't care if my body dies as well. And takes your heart too. The Emperor stumbled backwards. A messenger eunuch reported at this moment. Your Majesty, a message has arrived from the southern heaven. Come in. The Emperor was quiet for a long time. He had a hand on his forehead, and his face belied his defeat and frustration. It remained as such for a while. Then, he spoke up like a toddler who was learning to speak. Send it in. He extended his hand and unwinded the thread which rolled the paper in place. Then, he slowly opened it and gave it a look. However, his pupils shrunk as he looked at the letter, and his eyes suddenly resembled the sharp ones of a hawk. In fact, it seemed that the opened letter was like his greatest enemy. His hands trembled, and the piece of paper floated to the ground. However, the Emperor's hands were still positioned like they held the letter in place. His eyes had also become somewhat dull and motionless. In fact, it seemed that he had been struck by lightning. He then suddenly felt dizzy, and swayed a bit. In fact, he almost fell down. Then, he slowly looked down, and picked up the letter. He then gave it another read in a serious manner, and sighed. However, the Emperor still wasn't convinced of a single word he had read on the letter. He swayed as his face became deathly pale, and the letter again dropped down like a dead leaf in an autumn wind. Only he didn't pick it up this time. The content on that piece of paper was the same as the letters every other family had received. However, this letter was a lot more detailed. There were a few lines which had attracted the emperor's sight more than the others. Jun Moxie fought Xiao Buyu alone. Xiao Buyu killed himself in shame. It's suspected that Jun Moxie's strength has reached the level of a great master. Jun Moxie questioned about the matter of the past. And Xiao Buyu mentioned the blood sword hall as a matter of coincidence. Jun Wuyi's legs have recovered. He fought Xiao Han and won. And Jun Moxie has completely crippled Xiao Han. The eighth great master from the grasslands, the solitary falcon, is currently with the Jun family. Level of a great master. Blood sword hall. Solitary falcon. Jun Moxie. The emperor muttered these few words in a strange voice. The Jun family, the Jun family. The emperor gave a long sigh. There was a profound expression in his eyes as he closed them, and said tiredly, "I regret it. I shouldn't have shown such clemency at that time. And now I've to suffer for it." His voice was hoarse. In fact, it had trembled somewhat. He hurriedly walked out after that. However, he suddenly tripped at the door. He staggered violently as a result, and fell flat on his face. His guards rushed to help him in that pitiful situation, but he had already stood up before they arrived. He looked deep into the sky. It was then that something flashed in his mind. So, he turned around and focused on Princess Ling Meng's face. After that, his figure disappeared. Only mother and daughter remained in the Empress's quarters. And they were only left to look at each other in dismay. Princess Ling Meng shuddered as she took 2 steps and picked up the open letter from the ground. However, it seemed as if that piece of paper somehow weighed more than 1,000 kgs for her. She hated herself in this moment. Why did she have to hear so many secrets? This had been a huge blow to the princess. In fact, it was something she couldn't bear. She had finally started to see a glimmer of happiness during these past days. However, her father had spoken so many things, and had smashed this state of happiness in its entirety. She suddenly felt empty as a result, and couldn't lighten up anymore. So, she looked at her mother, but was only left to discover that the Empress's expression was the same as her own. The mother and daughter looked at each other, and became aware of the other's despair. The two snuggled together, and read the letter. However, the Empress's expression belied her conundrum after they had read it. She didn't know whether she ought to laugh or cry. She then sighed in helplessness, and spoke a sentence with profound sadness and loneliness. Princess Ling Meng resembled a frightened deer and was left to tremble after she heard what her mother had said. She powerlessly stumbled to the ground, and her eyes were brimming with fear and desperation. That's because the Empress had said, "Heavenly sin, it's like, we've sinned, and can't live anymore. We can't survive anymore. This happened too quickly. It's heaven's will. It's retribution. Jun Moxie. Jun Wuyi. Tian Xiang is finished." The young master Jun was traveling throughout the journey after being flushed with success as far as the others were concerned. But he was quite disturbed in reality. It could even be said that he staggered with each step. He was constantly shocked. His eyes had thistles and thorns under them, and they were filled with desolation. It seemed as if they had been bruised by the many vicissitudes he had suffered. Too many strange events had accompanied the young master on this journey. In fact, it could even be said that a unique expert had been playing pranks on the young master throughout the journey. And this had left the young master to feel extremely vexed. Moreover, he couldn't guard against it, and he couldn't hide against it. In fact, there wasn't any place to hide. One excessive example of these inconceivable events was he was riding with his men one day. However, the sky suddenly filled with a murder of crows. Then, all of them decided to relieve themselves at once. This was already very unreasonable in itself. But the matter still wasn't finished. And that's because the men weren't affected by this onslaught. Moreover, the crows had been extremely accurate. So, the only ones to get soaked were Jun Moxie and his horse. No normal person could have ever imagined that a murder of crows would relieve themselves together when they were flying overhead. The young Master Jun could also be considered a normal person in this regard. So, he had never imagined that such a thing either. And was hence at a loss. The awful stench soared to the skies and left everyone with a desire to vomit. Wasn't the young master a shit person now? And then, he was happily eating rice during mealtime. He was surrounded by his soldiers. He had finished most of his bowl when a living cockroach crawled out of it. These things could somehow be explained away as coincidences if they had happened once, even if they were extremely strange and uncanny. But could it still be called a coincidence after it had happened for the second, the third, or even the fourth time? However, things still didn't end there. After all, the shit person obviously wanted to get clean. So, he went to the river and cleaned himself with great difficulty. But his clean clothes were gone when he got ashore. He tried to look for them for a long time. He was obviously Niked that entire time. He didn't even notice where that sludge of mud was thrown at him from. He obviously had to go back to the river to clean himself again as a result. The timing of these strange occurrences was extremely ingenious as well. In fact, they gave the target next to no time to react. And even someone with superhuman reflexes like Jun Moxie could only hide for a bit. But he was still being fiddled with most of the time. Jun Moxie considered the facts. The earth stayed still and flat when the entire army marched over it. But it caved in with me and the horse when I rode over it. This incident obviously had too big a sign written all over it. But what kind of strength and talent could create such a pitfall so quickly? He hadn't even been sleeping in the tent at nights. That's because he would find brightly colored snakes within his undergarments when he'd wake up and put on his clothes in the morning. It had to be said that the young master would have been helpless if it weren't for the protection of the Hongjun Pagoda and Yin Yang escape. However, Jun Moxie's countermeasures and reactions made the party arranging these mischief look at him with admiration. After all, anyone else would have had a nervous breakdown in the face of these events. But Jun Moxie had somehow managed to seem lively. In fact, even his complexion hadn't become downcast. He went to wash himself in the river when he got dirty. However, he didn't try to look for his clothes this time. Instead, he disappeared from there, bare butt. It was obvious that no one knew where he had disappeared to. So, they merely scratched their heads and stared wide-eyed. He stopped eating the rice during the morning meals. In fact, he didn't even eat from the big wok. The young master roasted the snake meat instead. Moreover, he ate it with relish. Even his personal soldiers ate it till their fill. It would be such a pity to waste such a fat snake. And this left the onlooking snake king to gnash her teeth with explosive sounds. The crows also flew over his head again. However, he struck them down when they were still afar. They weren't good as food. But they were still a hunter's game. And game is a game. the pitfalls also appeared on the road again. And the target still went down. But it was only the horse that went down this time around, not the man who rode it. It seemed that Jun Moxie had continued to suffer losses throughout the journey in this one-of-a-kind battle. But he still seemed to have a belly full of appetite for these fights. And thus, the journey progressed in this manner. However, the people causing these mischiefs were left enraged. How can a lone person be so strong mentally? How are his mental defenses so powerful? Will he endure this to death? However, Jun Moxie had lived in a very nasty environment in his previous life. He had been through many experiences which had been far more dangerous than these one. Anyway, this was merely mischief. It obviously wasn't a question of life or death. So, this situation was far from the near-death experiences he had been through in the past. In fact, the young master felt a long-lost warm, amiable, and happy feeling even after these pranks. However, this left Mei Shuayan and Mei Qian to look at each other helplessly. Can such a freak exist among the ranks of men? After all, any other person would have been looking for a tree to hang from in the face of these pranks. Please subscribe to this channel so that we are more enthusiastic in providing the best video for you. Chapter 444 Returns to Tian Xiang. Jun Moxie had resolved most of the matter that surrounded the Xiao family. Therefore, most of this evil charms had subsided as far as that matter was concerned. However, the aura of his charms had still been growing around his body over the course of this journey. In fact, they had been becoming increasingly dense. But this increase in his aura was accompanied by a proportionately dulling look in his eyes. This change was surely very contradictory in nature. However, it only added an indescribable evil charm to his personality. This was the charisma of Jun Moxie from his previous life. This was the charisma of someone who'd look askance at the world, and would look down on all creation. It was the same then. It was the same now. Dugu Xiao Yi looked at Jun Moxie, and couldn't make it out properly. Jun Moxie had seldom gone to the girls' area after he had beaten the Xiao family. He had mostly stuck with the men instead. Guan Qinghan could still remain calm, but Dugu Xiao Yi couldn't contain herself. So, she'd regularly run to see Jun Moxie. But her efforts didn't produce any results. It was because Jun Moxie had been truly disappearing during these days. He didn't spend much time outside. Instead, the young master spent most of it inside the Hongjun Pagoda, and would focus of his efforts to promote his cultivation. The clenched fist is the greatest argument in this world. Jun Moxie wanted to replace the sword which Jun Wuyi had used with one of the 9 divine swords he had forged. But Jun Wuyi didn't agree to it. He said that the sword he was currently using was fine, and he was satisfied with it. But he was mainly attached to that sword because this was the weapon he had used to defeat Xiao Han. That sword had cleansed the greatest shame of Jun Wuyi's life. So, he would treasure it even if it was merely a scrap of iron. Moreover, hadn't this sword also been forged with Jun Moxie's turning iron into wonderful gold technique? Its quality may not have been as good as the 9 swords Jun Moxie had forged later, but it was still an extremely rare and divine weapon in the eyes of the mortal world. Jun Moxie understood this feeling very well. So, he didn't insist further. Moreover, the quality of the weapon wasn't always the final parameter. After all, it was also important to find the perfect man for the sword. A man and a sword which suit each other well had the potential to take their abilities to great heights. Jun Wuyi wasn't the only one who was like that. The young master also nourished his divine weapon, the blood of yellow flame. Men have souls. And swords have spirits. And things could only work in perfect sync if the two had a deep connection. Jun Xie wasn't aware of any sword spirits or their legends. But he also believed that divine weapons which could cleave iron like it was clay must have some spirits within them. Perhaps it depended on the swordsman's psychology. For instance, a swordsman mustn't deserve to hold a sword if he didn't feel any connection to it, even if it were made of the best metals. Therefore, Jun Xie would use that golden method to tune his mind's reaction to the sword's movements. He would also try to experience and understand the sword. After all, that sword was the only companion which would never betray him. People could change. And people could betray. But the sword would never do it. Never. It could only accompany its master forever, until the sword broke. Or the man died. Jun Xie had even felt his sword tremble once they had reached close to the Xiang city. It was because it had sensed ruthless and bloody events lying ahead. In fact, it seemed as if it thirsted for slaughter. That kind of faint murderous intention had also triggered Jun Xie's murderous aura. And his aura had also started to become denser as his sword's intention became stronger. His face had become increasingly still. His expression had become increasingly demonic, while his heart had started to beat more violently. The men and horses circled a mountain. Jun Xie and Jun Wuyi gazed at the small mountain in unison. It was that same mountain by chance. This was where Jun Xie had slaughtered the blood sword hall to loot the crossbows. But he now knew that his actions hadn't been unjust. After all, the blood sword hall had been the Jun family's enemy this entire time. Even their deaths can't absolve their crimes. The road ahead seemed empty. However, Tianzhang city's walls could be faintly seen in the moonlight if one were to raise their head and look. Jun Xie's narrowed eyes lit up with sharp flashes of light. It was like a sleeping god of death had suddenly opened his eyes and his large malevolent mouth. His murderous aura rose with an explosion, and surged forth in a tyrannical manner. The god of death had opened his eyes. The king of hell looked, and the king of evil focused. This journey has been long, but I will finally see who has been creating this chaos and gossip in Tianxiang city. Jun Xie's sword half drew itself out of the scabbard with a loud screech after it sensed his murderous aura. It glistened brightly and clearly in the light. It looked very threatening. It appeared as if those bright clouds that were tinged with sunset had suddenly descending onto the world. Or, as if the ruler of heaven and earth had suddenly opened his cold and murderous eyes. The ruler looked down on the common people as he overlooked the whole world. It seemed that he would confront the upcoming tides of chaos. And he would show no quarter as he prepared to slaughter in a maddened frenzy. This murderous aura pierced straight into Tianxiang. The men around Jun Xie felt the arrival of a terrible, awe-inspiring, and frightening power beside them. It took them a moment to realize what had come to happen. However, they discovered that Jun Xie had already left their side by then. In fact, he had walked 30 meters ahead. Moreover, these iron-blooded soldiers, these veterans of hundreds of wars, were finding it hard to endure Jun Xie's aura at this moment. Even the profoundly strong Mei Shuai-Yan opened her eyes flabbergasted. She then looked at that man's sword, and frowned. The others wouldn't have thought much of it. But she could sense that the sword was every bit as powerful and awe-inspiring as the man who wielded it. This man and his sword can make for two very formidable opponents. And the two of them could easily pose a huge threat to me when combined. How can this be? That is only a sword, and nothing more. It may be unique in its quality, and it may be unrivaled in its sharpness. But it's still an inanimate object. So, why is it giving me such a strange feeling? In fact, that sword seems more dangerous than Jun Xie. The army set up camp 15 kilometers away from Xiang city. This was a custom. The army mustn't enter the imperial city at once after it had returned triumphant. They would receive their orders, and the high-ranking generals would enter the city first. The rest of the army would only be allowed to return to their barracks later. Jun Xie moved to the front of the army at once. They heard a loud screech. This strange sound had sourced from the flagpole of the carriage beside them. The flag was hoisted to flutter in the wind as a result. However, there was a whooshing sound after that, and the flagpole suddenly sprouted half as many more. In fact, it seemed as if a sharp sword had pierced the heavens. This was a very strange thing. So, it was obvious that the men who saw it were left dumbstruck. But no one dared to ask why when they sensed that restrained but tyrannical aura that was emanating from Jun Xie. It seemed like Jun Xie was a volcano which had remained dormant for thousands of years. However, this volcano was about to erupt soon. Suddenly, a loud bugle sounded inside Xiang city. The drawbridge fell down, and a group of riders suddenly rode out with a thunderous sound. 2 huge banners were also dropped down from the walls on either side of the gate. On the left marked the divine power of the Blood General. On the right marked victorious from the southern heaven city. Then, an ordered troop of men came out following the first group of riders. This was the official ceremonial honors to receive a triumphant general. The first group of riders drew closer with a thunderous sound. However, they didn't decrease their speed. In fact, they rode with increasing swiftness. But Jun Moxie couldn't help but smile at the sight of the man in front. It has been a long time since we've met, donghua. Jun Moxie knew that this was a suicide mission when he had gone to war. But he had returned hale and healthy, and was finally meeting his friend after a long time. So, he smiled and moved forward to meet him. But then, he noticed that something was wrong. He couldn't help but be stunned by this realization, and was forced to rein his horse. He saw that the donghua family's general donghua was riding forth with his 2 large sons and nephews. In fact, one could see that General Donghua's hedgehog quills-like beard was quivering like a young dragon's as they got closer. His eyes were opened wide like round bells, and it seemed as if he could shoot fire out of them. It seemed like the horses won't stop until the man had arrived. However, this man suddenly gave a loud roar at this time. Debauchee, Xiang, Tian, come the feck out, you 3 bastards! His voice shook everything like thunder. And, Xiao, you come out quickly too. Arg! You've angered me as well. Listening to this roar was enough to tell that General Donghua was extremely mad. In fact, it was evident that he was unable to restrain his rage. Debauchee, Xiang, Tian, the 3 members of the donghua families, heroes and legends bravely rushing forward, felt like their souls had flown away in fear after they listened to Donghua's loud roar. The 3 brothers had calculated their actions beforehand, and were happy with it. They had thought that they would enter the city, receive their orders, and would then flee to the Western Front to seek shelter under their fathers and uncles. They obviously knew that they couldn't return home. After all, their skin would be flayed in case they did. But they hadn't expected that Donghua would come forth to catch them outside. And that too with such speed. The 3 looked at each other in dismay for a moment, and started to tremble when they saw the terror in the other's eyes. So, They dejectedly came out after dilly-dallying for a while. They had obviously realized that hiding wouldn't be good for their cause. However, they resembled defeated troops, and were emanating an aura of defeat on their personas. "I'll deal with you three wretched disgraces." Wudi's eyes were opened wide as he panted hoarsely and called out. He raised his horsewhip. "I had sent you three to watch over your little sister. Your sister, right? Ha! Are the three of you just good for looking like giant bears on a battlefield? Dang it! Why don't you eat hot shit? You don't like living? Why don't you go to hell then? My Dugu family would be well if it rids itself of you good-for-nothing losers." There was no nonsense. Only a crack of the horsewhip. However, the three burly youngsters stood there motionless. In fact, they even winked and pulled faces at each other. "We foresaw that we would be whipped. So, we wore armor under our clothes. Anyway, everything will be fine as long as he doesn't tell us by looking at our faces. Hee hee. Dugu Xiao Yi? Why haven't you come out? You filthy little girl? You can hide for a while. But can you hide forever? Come out quickly. And face me." Dugu Wudi cracked his whip twice in front of the crowd. He then threw it aside and screamed like a black bear. The ceremonial guards had also arrived by that time. In fact, their front was almost upon Dugu Wudi. "Daddy, this daughter has missed you a lot." Dugu Xiao Yi slowly walked out from the army. In fact, each step she took was unusually slow. You. General Dugu shot one glance at her. Then, everything went dark before his eyes, and he fell to the ground. Please subscribe to this channel so that we are more enthusiastic in providing the best video for you. Chapter 445. You'll be a grandpa. Dugu Wudi's eyes opened wide as he became stupefied. He then raised his trembling finger. You. He couldn't even say half a word more for a long while. Suddenly, there was the sound of something falling as he tumbled down with a thump and lay sprawled on his back. He was in a pitiful position, but he still strained his neck and turned his eyes to look at his daughter. However, he couldn't believe it even after getting an eyeful of her. Jun Xie was also left shocked at the sight of it. In fact, his eyes had ferociously popped outwards. What's this? What's happening here? As for Dugu Chong, Dugu Xiang and Dugu Tian, the eyes of the three brothers had also nearly popped out of their sockets. They saw Dugu Xiao Yi holding her belly as she walked in a careful manner. Her body looked very bloated. This was the figure of a pregnant woman who had suffered a lot of hardships and was nearing her time of labor. In fact, it seemed like she wouldn't even be able to see her toes if she looked down. This girl's body was slender until yesterday. In fact, she would have been blown away with a gust of wind. So, how come she has such a big belly now? This is too great a speed. Anyway, her belly wouldn't have become so big even if she had become pregnant in October and was on the eve of childbirth. Not to mention that we didn't even do it. Anyway, her belly wouldn't have become so big this fast even if we had done it, right? This little girl is too bold. Jun Xie didn't know whether to laugh or cry for a moment. It turns out that this girl has resorted to this final trick now. Jun Xie laughed, but he also suddenly felt a bit touched. This girl's move was undoubtedly willful and troublesome. But it also showed that she truly and wholeheartedly loved Jun Xie. In fact, it seemed that her affection had reached a point where the situation didn't matter to her. "I don't care what the cost is. I love Jun Xie. And I want to marry Jun Xie. Her ways of handling matters was very similar to that of the young masters. The young master would also do what he wished. He would never care about what the others would think or say. The little girl had also ignored everything else out of her love for him. The two of them weren't mirror images, but they had a lot of similarities. Therefore, one could imagine what that little girl must have had to bear when she decided to come out like this in front of the huge army at the gates of Tian Xiang city. After all, she was the only girl in the third generation of a family as influential as the Donghua family. What would happen to her reputation? The little girl wasn't foolish. Nor was it that she didn't know the consequences. But she had still done it without any hesitation. She was acting willfully. But this also showed her determination to follow the young master even though he'd have to face the criticisms of Tian Xiang. This act was ridiculous. But it said to Jun Moxie, I will accompany you, no matter how much I have to suffer for it. You won't be alone. You will never be alone. Because you will always have me. The corners of Jun Moxie's callous mouth suddenly became soft. His heart had been moved by the acts of that silly and naive Donghua Xiao. The affections of that little girl were this strong, how else could one regard her? Xiao, you. I. It's a sin. It's a sin. I will hammer it. Where's the... Donghua Wudi hit his head with a slam. The magnificent general's eyes and nose had started to run. He shouted out. Yet no one answered. He shouted again. But it didn't work. Daddy. Don't be like this. Donghua Xiao became anxious. And forgot that she was supposed to be pregnant. She quickly rushed towards her father without thinking. She obviously hadn't had much practice with her props. So, it was quite likely that the stuffing would fall out if she was to try and cover distances at a running speed. Stop. You, don't move, you foolish girl, you'll cause a disaster. Donghua Wudi turned pale with fright. And jumped up. He wasn't even able to grieve properly. And was left to extend his arms to stop her instead. He then spoke nervously. Don't move, the fetus will be in trouble. AAA, Donghua Xiao quickly came to herself. And realized the condition she was supposedly in. She obviously couldn't run or jump in this condition. So, she stopped her dash. And her hands cautiously reached for her belly in fear that the stuffing had come out. Then, she faced upwards and walked awkwardly like a penguin as she lovingly said, Don't get angry, Daddy. Your daughter is unworthy. But I'll be a mama. And you'll be a grandpa, you should be happy, not mad. I'm not angry. I'm not angry. I should be happy. I should be happy, ah. Donghua Wudi hoarsely gasped for air. However, his beady eyes were blue with anger. And his heart was hammering in his chest as he resisted bursting with fury. Then, he used his finger to poke at his daughter's belly. Some of it was with malice, while some of it was in excitement. Who? General Donghua had fathered many children. So, he had seen women carrying children. Therefore, it was unusual that he was fooled so easily. After all, the little girl had left home only a few months ago. Therefore, his daughter's body shouldn't have gotten so big this early even if she was pregnant. However, the first impression of his daughter's act was so strong that he simply ignored this elementary fact. Hick? What? Who? Donghua Xiao was stunned. Her eyes turned as round as saucers as she asked. Donghua Wudi nearly vomited blood. He trembled as he looked at Donghua Xiao. The man nearly sobbed blood and burst his liver as he roared. I'm asking, whose child is it? Whose? Oh, this. Dugu Xiao bashfully hung her head and replied in a low voice. Who else could it be? Brother Mo Xia. Dugu Wudi panted with anger. He had been prepared, but seeing his treasured daughter appear in front of him with that big belly had suddenly made the general lose himself. He clenched his teeth and stamped his feet. He then faced upwards and roared, Jun Mo Xie. I will castrate you. Jun Mo Xie stood amidst the troops. However, his soul was left to tremble when he heard this. Ha! Castrate me? On what basis? Your daughter drugged me and left me to hover between life and death. Yet, you want to castrate me. Isn't this injustice? What are you saying, Daddy? Dugu Xiao stamped her feet, and her face reddened. Her small hands covered her ears as she summoned her courage to open her mouth. She hadn't experienced the intimacy of a relation between a man and woman, but she understood what castration meant. So, she obviously wasn't happy about it. Don't stamp your foot, don't stamp your foot. Dugu Wudi jumped up with urgency. He madly scratched his head. My dearest. Your body supports 2 lives. So, it won't be able to handle big movements. Please be careful. The ceremonial guards finally rushed up panting at this time. They turned to Jun Wu and waved a marquee, Imperial Edict. Jun Wu will receive Imperial Edict. I'll take your grandma's mouth. Dugu Wudi stamped his feet. He had a belly full of anger, but nowhere to vent it. And that's when he heard the court eunuch speak. Dugu Wudi's anger had covered his ears like heavy clouds shroud a mountain top with mist. So, he wasn't able to hear what the eunuch had proclaimed. He suddenly erupted like a volcano, kicked out, and cursed. Curse your family to the 18th generation. Screw your grandma's thighs. Can't you see I'm busy? I'll tear your grandma's mouth right up to her ass till she calls me uncle. The court eunuch heard these curses as he flipped 10 times in the sky like a roasting fish. Then, his body made a squishy sound as he fell to the ground. He gave out a squeak and became unconscious immediately after. The imperial edict he had held wasn't very fortunate either, and fell into a puddle with a splash. The water obviously didn't care whether it was an imperial edict or not. It drenched it with a murmur, and left the writing on it to become hazy. Everyone's eyeballs hopped in disorder. No one had ever seen anyone beat an imperial envoy, not since antiquity. Moreover, Dugu Wudi had cursed so bizarrely and fluently that they turned their heads several times in order to understand the curses he had hurled. This imperial envoy had been very unlucky. After all, the reward being bestowed upon Jun Wue wasn't small. So, it could be considered that Jun Wue would have rewarded him as well. In fact, he had been dreaming of getting rich. But, how could he have expected to be kicked on the face out of the blue? Therefore, he was still confused with regard to the turn of events when he lost consciousness. In fact, he didn't even know what offense he had committed. Jun Wue had looked on when the imperial envoy was coming over. He was dressed in his proper general's attire. After all, it was necessary for him to be prepared to receive this decree in style. However, Jun Wue then saw that the imperial envoy was suddenly kicked away. He had only heard the envoy speak. Jun Wue will receive an imperial edict, Ak. The third Master Jun stared blankly at Dugu Wudi for a long while at first. Then, he sighed and spoke up. Elder brother Dugu, you've charged into disaster with this. I charged into disaster. Brother Wue, This guy isn't good. Dugu Wudi didn't get what Jun Wui had said. So he glared and shouted. Your nephew attacked and our asterisk ped. I can never stand him. Where's that bastard Jun Moxie? Come to me. Show yourself and die by my hands. There was a clatter of hooves, and young Master Jun moved out of the crowd atop his horse. His lips were red, his teeth were white, and his facial features looked handsome and elegant. His graceful bearing made him look extremely cultured. Jun Moxie. You little bastard. Arg. Arg. Dugu Wudi's eyes reddened as he pounced. But Jun Moxie evaded with a whooshing sound and stood on top of a flagpole twice or thrice his size. Then, he jumped down the flagpole with a brushing sound and moved to the top of a dozens of feet tall flagpole with another brushing sound. He then spoke. You, what are you doing? I have nothing to do with this matter. You check again and speak. You're going crazy. But at least find a proper target to get mad at. The flagpole was too high. General Dugu's skill sets were surely good, but he couldn't jump that high. And the flexible flagpole wouldn't have been able to support his big and burly body if he had jumped on top of it. So he could only stand under the flagpole and become angry upon hearing Jun Moxie's remarks. What? You have nothing to do with it? Who else would? Feck. I should understand this matter better. You've ruined my daughter's innocence. And you're not even ready to admit it. And I should understand better. Dugu Wudi trebled with rage. So grabbed Jun Moxie's flagpole with his hands and shook it violently. Consequently, Jun Moxie was left to whirl around like a TR*Ps artist atop that pole. Please subscribe to this channel so that we are more enthusiastic in providing the best video for you. Chapter 446. Trouble arrives. General Dugu was furious, but he was still somewhat in his sense. Otherwise, breaking the staff with his amazing strength wouldn't have been out of the ordinary. Dugu Wudi's words were very fierce. But even his own heart hadn't reconciled with them for the sake of his daughter's lifetime of happiness. Daddy. Dugu Xiao wiped her tears and jumped. Why are you making such a scene? Your daughter. I'm ashamed to see this. I don't want to live, boo-hoo. Dugu Wudi jumped scared and hastily let go off the flagpole. His face suddenly became sullen and nervous. Dear Xiao, don't fidget. You'll injure my grandchild. You shouldn't get angry, you know. Dugu Xiao's face had reddened since her father was still twisting at the pole and wasn't ready to let go. She then said angrily, You still haven't let him down. What will you do if he falls from such height and gets hurt? Dugu Wudi rolled his eyes. He thought, this brat is at the first level of the Sky Xian realm. And he's far more powerful in comparison. So how can he fall and get injured? However, he could only speak up in a hateful manner. Let him drop and break. You come home with me instead. However, General Dugu knew the ways of the world. He knew about this Jun bastard's strength as well. So he was aware that couldn't win against him on his own. In fact, even the entire Dugu family couldn't win against his lone strength. After all, this youngster had managed to stand his own against a level 4 spirit Xian expert. However, the Jun brat had climbed onto that pole instead of fronting off against him. This obviously meant that he was giving face to General Dugu. However, General Dugu still couldn't help his anger since the thought of her daughter being pregnant with his child wouldn't leave his mind. So, he decided that it was better to leave this matter until they had returned home. But General Dugu suddenly had a severe headache when he imagined the dangerous situation he'd have to face once he'd return home. His mind was sent into a whirl at this thought. He then pointed with his horsewhip and said, "I'm still not happy. Pick up that palanquin and bring it to me. Do it quickly." This was the sedan chair that Imperial Envoy had arrived riding on to make the announcement. Dugu Wudi had obviously decided to commandeer it as if it was his natural right to. Jun Moxie quickly took the opportunity to slip down the flagpole. He then wiped his cold sweat. The Dugu family is full of annoying people. All of them are too bold. What can I say which wouldn't leave Dugu Wudi embarrassed after Dugu Xiao Yi's antics? That Dugu Xiao Yi has stretched the matters to such extremes. So, how can I dilly-dally and show false bravado as a man? I'll have to marry whether I like it or not. That's the way these matters stand right now. Otherwise, the relations between the Jun and the Dugu family will break forever. And the Dugu family would either have to be eliminated entirely, or this animosity would continue throughout the ages. It had to be said that the little girl had put on this show with good intentions in her heart. But it had still delivered extremely grave results. The two families had been left without a way out. In fact, there was no way to mediate this situation now. It may be found that the pregnancy was fake once she had returned home. However, so many people had seen this act. So, even fake had become the truth by now. Dugu Xiao Yi had nerves of steel. But Jun Moxie was no lesser in that regard. Feck it. Can't I take more than one wife? Don't I still have that advantage? This little girl is younger than me. But she's still a refreshing beauty. Moreover, she's deeply devoted to me. Didn't she say that she can't lose me? I will make her my mistress. Jun Moxie snorted in a sinister manner. He looked at whatever mysterious object Dugu Xiao Yi had propped her belly with malicious intentions. He then fiercely thought, "I'll make that belly big for real one of these days." Ha! What are you guys doing over there? Dugu Wudi turned his head and discovered that the people who had come carrying the palanquin were dressed up in the clothes of royal servants. He quickly came to himself and said, "Oh, you've come to issue a decree, right? But you won't mind if I use this palanquin, would you?" Everyone looked at each other in dismay. A dark line had formed on their foreheads. Our leader was struck unconscious by you while he was proclaiming the decree. And you want his palanquin too now. Dugu Wudi had finally realized what he had done. So, he rushed to the Imperial Envoy and crouched over his unconscious body. He couldn't help but frown as he said, "This isn't good." This general had only swept him aside. How could this happen to him? However, everyone still remained silent. "You're the one who caused this. And you're asking others about this now? You swept him aside. Who in Tian Xiang can bear being swept aside by you? Well, let it be. It doesn't matter. Third Master Jun, you can ask the Emperor about your reward on your way back anyway. Don't forget to take that reward on your way back home. I reckon that your reward would be quite something. Oh, and remember to call me out for a drink later. He will drink my family's special golden wine. I think I should go and talk this matter out with my old man. And you should also explain things to your old man. Then we'll let those two sort this matter out." "Well, that's great. This is how we'll go about it. Di spoke this part in a very casual manner, and gently ushered his daughter into the palanquin after. He then waved his whip above his head, and fiercely turned to look at Jun Moxie. I'll look for you to settle our debts, you brat. And don't forget to send over some wine jars when you get home. Don't you dare go making eyes. Move. He gave a kick to the sides of his huge horse. It neighed in response, and went away like the wind. He's taking himself to be my father-in-law now. Everyone looked at each other in dismay. They knew the trouble they could get into with these people if they didn't act tactfully. So, they were accustomed to keeping a straight face even at such strange events. They smiled and waved their hands, and made their way back to the city with the imperial servants. However, they hadn't even reached the city's gates when they suddenly heard chaotic and ceaseless sounds of cursing from inside. Then, a group of properly dressed-up scholars came rushing out. The face of each one was full of hatred, and their eyes were reeking of disdain. They were being led by a few people. These were the ones whom Jun Moxie had previously insulted in public. Jun Moxie's pupils dilated at this sight, and his expression became serious. Then, a monstrous murderous aura rose from his body. Jun Moxie looked around, and noticed that there weren't even a few hundred people beside him. Jun Wu was there. So were the young masters of other big families and their guards. Guan Qinghan's carriage was also there. Mei Shuayan and Mei Qian were in the carriage as well. However, the warriors of the Dugu family had already entered the city with Dugu Wudi. The other young masters looked at the young master Jun at this point, and started to take joy in his calamity. You're so awe-inspiring. But even you may not be able to resist the curses of everyone in the world. We'd like to see how this kills you, Jun Moxie, hee hee. Jun Moxie, you ill-behaved low-life. You've even dared to return to Tian. Xiang, the speaker had a tall stature. He was moving slowly and gently like a scholar. However, his face was full of disdain. It was the same scholar Jun Moxie had seen in the festival Hanji Dong. Jun Moxie had disrupted the scholarly festival at that time when his antics. Moreover, he had humiliated the head scholars, and numerous other upcoming and talented scholars. Jun Moxie had also beaten each one of these scholars. So, none of them had gotten the opportunity to become imperial officials. This meant that Jun Moxie had obstructed their clear path to the top. And it had seemed that they would never get such a good chance ever again. These talented scholarly disciples had been dreaming of an official status their entire lives. So, how could they endure the result? What came of those 10 years of bitter hardships? What came of those extremely exhausting studies over so many years? We studied so much to sit with princes and emperors. But we haven't been able to accomplish anything because of this rotten Jun Moxie. He's guilty of many crimes. He's guilty beyond redemption. However, Jun Moxie had gotten himself involved in a world-shocking and rare actual scandal. So, how could these scholars not take this chance to hit him when he was down? Jun Moxie has to pay the ultimate price. You may be brazen, Jun Moxie, but that mistress of yours can't have such thick skin. You won't die from getting cursed, but you will surely drown in spit of the common people. Therefore, those scholars gave their all to instigate the rumors and facts alike. Everyone had swarmed to the city's gates at this time. You wish to enter the city? Get lost. You'll have to enter through our spit. We've heard that unchaste sister-in-law of his is also amongst them. She also shouldn't be shy enough to die so soon. It could be said that this plan of those scholars was very malicious. There's an old saying. The ones who slaughter dogs to uphold the law will never be able to uphold the scholarly wisdom. However, these scholarly students were too upset. So, they had become even more rogue than hoodlums. One isn't afraid of playing rogue after they've done it once. And that's because they aren't afraid of the rogue's culture anymore. That's the truth. Di had noticed this parade when he was going in. But he had decided to let Jun Moxie suffer and wouldn't help out. After all, his maiden daughter was pregnant. So, he wouldn't have been able to bear the repercussion if he provoked any more trouble. Also, there were the old men who were anxiously waiting to hold their great-grandchild. Therefore, General Dugu pretended not to see and slipped away. Do I even have the honor to return? Why should I feel ashamed to return? I obviously have enough honor to return. I've been victorious in battle. I have the greatest honor in the world to return. So, why? Do you think otherwise? However, Jun Moxie remained calm and collected, and prevented Jun Xie from getting involved by speaking up first. After all, those people had dared to gather there. So, that obviously meant that they didn't fear the blood general. This also indicated that they might have someone powerful behind them. Therefore, it may not be useful even if Jun Xie got involved. In fact, he might end up provoking more curses from them. And it could even have turned into an ocean and drowned everyone. Only an extreme method would work at this time. Only an extremely bloody method could suppress this. In fact, the resolution method of this matter would have to set such a bloody precedent that people would have to fear even coughing on this matter aloud. This was the only way this matter could be suppressed in a through manner now. Rumors? Jun Moxie gave a callous laugh inside. He simply couldn't understand their actions. Can rumors ever be more terrifying than a blade? So what if the whole world condemns me? Do you think you can kill me with this? I think that dying under the pressure of rumors is the ways of a coward. You will confront me with these rumors. And I will kill until no one has the guts to speak up about this anymore. I'll kill anyone who talks. Anyway, how many people are brave in the face of death? I'll even slaughter everyone if I need to. You're extremely shameless. Jun Moxie. You even dare to talk like this. You and your dirty sister-in-law, you're a shameless and adulterous couple. Everyone has a right to punish you severely. These words were very sharp and cold. Moreover, these unpleasant words could be heard very clearly by Guan Qinghan inside the carriage. She couldn't help but pale even though she had been preparing her heart for this. She couldn't prevent her eyes from being filled with despair and grief after she listened to the clamorous and heaven-shaking accusations from outside. She had been expecting such a scene. But Guan Qinghan came to face this in real life now. And she realized that she couldn't bear it. Please subscribe to this channel so that we are more enthusiastic in providing the best video for you. Chapter 447. I'll give you two choices. Mei Shuayan was sitting beside Guan Qinghan. The corners of her mouth twitched for no reason. She didn't know why, but she felt anger rising within her. The young woman felt a sudden desire to rush out of the carriage and help. In fact, she felt like stamping on those ants until they had been turned into ground meat. What is thing? These people would get blown away by a breath. But they still dare to do this in front of the strongest man of his generation? Has this world become so unrecognizable to me? The person who had spoken that last sentence was another scholarly disciple. He had also been there at the Scholars' Festival. His name was Qin Qiushi. His face was cold and full of vitality. His whole frame reeked of strength derived from this self-styled moral character. Ah, I remember you. You're called Qin Qiushi, right? Ah, doesn't your name mean that you diligently seek to be shit? It's probably a good name. But it leaves me confused whether you want to be shit or serve as an official. Your name doesn't make its meaning very obvious. Jun Moxie smiled as he looked at him and spoke this. His eyes were cold as ice. I only wish to ask you this: you've leveled these allegations against me. But where have they come from? What's the basis for these? Where have these come from? What's the basis for these? Jun Moxie. You still think that it's still not clear at such an important point? The debauchery you and your sister-in-law have committed is a despicable matter. It is devoid of any shame. You two make for an adulterous couple. But you still think that you can conceal this from the world? What are you playing innocent for? You may be the grandson of this country's great general. You may even be the heir to a noble family. But you can't hide your innate shamelessness. Qin Qiushi's face paled with anger as he pointed his finger and rained curses. Ah, good. You're filled with righteous indignation. That's very good. Do you have anything else to add? Jun Moxie picked his ears. Jun Moxie. Are you telling us that elder brother's words aren't enough to make you feel ashamed? Another scholar came forth. He looked at Jun Moxie with resentment. You're an offspring of generals. You will become a noble later. You live a life of luxury and splendor, and you will receive the vast kindness of the emperor. It could be said that you're already standing at the peak of Tian Xiang. But you still did such a deed while not knowing any sense of honor? You've ruined my Tian Xiang's reputation. Do you know that our Tian Xiang has become a laughing stock for the neighboring nations? You would have killed yourself in shame long ago if you had any conscience. But you've instead appeared at Tian Xiang city's gate in a just and honorable manner. You're acting innocent after all this? You're extremely shameless. Aren't you capable of sensing any shame? Jun Moxie. This was another talented scholar named Yan Feng. He was also a known face. Jun Moxie finally came to understand the matter. It seems that the Wenxing Heavenly Literature Institute wants to fight me to the death. Let me give you guys another lesson in grief if that's the case. These words instigated the huge crowds that stood behind. And they started to chant loudly. Adulterous couple. Even death can't wipe your crimes. Go to hell. So, I was guilty of such crimes? Jun Moxie laughed gleefully and asked Yan Feng. Yan Feng. I may or may not have any sense of shame. But what does it have to do with you? Why do you stand forth? Scoundrels and adulterous couples should be punished severely. So, why can't I stand forth? I can't compare with you in terms of power or martial strength. But our institute stands to embody a righteous environment. Shameless scoundrels like you must be shamed. We must make the world pure and peaceful again. Yan Feng shouted loudly. His face was full of self-righteousness. That's very well said. We may have nothing, but we'll still have a righteous environment. It's important that we keep the world pure and peaceful. That group of scholars cheered loudly. They were so emotionally stirred that their faces had reddened. Jun Moxie took pity on them as he watched the atmosphere become increasingly ardent. This was because he could feel an extremely tyrannical aura rising within his heart. A very righteous environment, ha ha ha. Jun Moxie suddenly started to laugh. A good environment of righteousness, or what you call a good and righteous is the one where you place your morality at the top and criticize others' ethics. Right? So, your so-called righteous environment is supposed to control other people's emotions? Your righteous environment dictates that the only match made by your parents' choice is a proper one? Perhaps it dictates that it's all right to force an innocent woman to death? The eyes of Han Ji-dong, Qin Qiu-shi, Yan Feng, and the others they led flashed with a frenetic guilt when they heard the term innocent woman. Jun Moxie looked into their eyes and understood that these men knew of Guanqing Han's innocent. She was only a fish in a pond that had been caught in a storm. But they still wanted to create trouble for her. Jun Moxie's murderous aura powerfully surged once again. I know your real aim. You're here because I ruined your scholarly festival and blocked your road to becoming officials. And you want to take revenge for it now, hee. I spoke correctly. Didn't I? Jun Moxie's glare was ice cold. So what? Jun Moxie, you've become even guiltier after you've mentioned this matter. These gifted scholars didn't feel ashamed when these words were said. Instead, the righteous Yan Feng continued angrily. The movement of your lips have blocked the careers of 5,000 gifted scholars. You don't have any conscience. We studied extremely hard from sunrise to sunset, with the only desire of helping the nation's people. However, a man who commits such debauchery destroyed the decades' worth of hard work of 5,000 people. And there will only be a mediocre and simple life for us from now on. You've buried our future prospects. Are you telling me that you still don't deserve any punishment? Doesn't your conscience make you feel ashamed? And you've committed more evil now. You and your sister-in-law are an adulterous couple. You two fool around and are replete with vices. In fact, the very stench of it fills the sky. Someone who commits such sins can't live under this heaven. You will face condemnation from the whole world now. And you must die before you apologize if you have any sense of shame. A strenuous life of studies, for the good of the people. We could have expected that from you guys? From a group of ill-intentioned bookworms. Could we have expected all that? You blindly make reprisals and involve an innocent and weak woman because of your personal grudges. Then, you quickly seek to hound others to death. Is this the quality of your efforts for the sake of this nation's people? Jun Moxie snorted. Let me tell you, get your own conscience straight if you seek to help the nation's people. Your hearts are stained. You people would only make corrupt officials. Nothing more. It doesn't matter for how many decades such people undertake strenuous studies. You people are pieces of shit even if you study your entire lives. Jun Moxie spewed burning venom as he spoke. And you needn't worry about that mediocre life you would have to lead. I can point out another avenue of livelihood for you. In fact, this one will cover you in profit and make your families extremely wealthy. He suddenly smiled and said, I have a friend. His name is Wu Shan Yun. But everyone calls him the Mountain of Zul references. He had once said something about people like you. I never understood what he had said. In fact, I thought that it was only random nonsense. But his words suddenly make sense of me now. He had said, people who stick their alls without any good reason will never find peace in hearts or future. And there will come one day when their buttocks will be pulled open 100 times over for it. Jun Moxie burst out in laughter. Therefore, it can be said that your future road is very wide. You only need to shed your skin of morality and tuck in your butt cheeks. And you'll then be covered in money. It's not a very big market, but each country's nobility is used to keeping a male slave. They particularly like people who've achieved something in their lives. So, you seasoned and gifted scholars will be a huge deal in the market. Jun Moxie. You're insulting us, many gifted scholars roared. Only you can have such a dirty mind to think of such things. To disgrace such a refined culture is to be guilty of terrible crimes. You are very vulgar. Vulgar. Vulgar your grandma. Do you think you're refined? Your methods are dirty with filthy motivations. And you're still calling me vulgar? Anger suddenly rose in Jun Moxie's heart. I'm in no mood to discuss the whole truth of the matter at this time. Anyway, I'm sure that you people already know the gist of it. So, you needn't deny it. Moreover, I have no obligation to give you an explanation even if you don't know. You're a bunch of dog shit in my eyes. You people are scum from head to toe. Scholars. You're a fecking joke. You're a bunch that sells their asses. You people look dirty at first sight. Thousands of people made a cacophony when they heard this. They shouted and hurled abuses from everywhere. In fact, the vulgarity of those scholars couldn't even be matched by the marketplace merchants. The outrage that Jun Moxie had instigated was like a wave of anger which was hard to control. Guan Qinghan shivered inside the carriage. Her head was hung low, her face was buried deep in her hands, and her shoulders were trembling. Jun Moxie roared, and suddenly stood up on his horse's back. You feel righteous even when you're implicating the innocent. So, you shouldn't blame me for being vicious and merciless. Could you even blame me for matching your standards? Jun Moxie moved his aura through his dantian after he finished speaking. Then, he shouted, "Bring it up." Suddenly, there was a wave amongst the crowd, and it divided them into two. A group of burly men walked through the crowd like huge sailboats through the sea. These were members of Jun Moxie's Heaven Destroyer team who he had sent to assist Bailey Luo Yun in his assassinations. They had arrived several days ago. They had quietly entered the Tian Xiang city, and were attentively gauging the city's activities on Jun Moxie's orders. They were carrying 3 women. These women had delicate figures, and their facial features were graceful as well. However, their faces were overrun with fear. Some men were pulling along big wolf dogs, while some others were dragging big and white pigs. The faces of Yan Feng, Qin Qiushi, and Han Jidong turned a miserable color as the 3 of them blurted out, "My dear." It turned out that those 3 women were their wives. I don't want to waste any effort in telling you the truth. You don't have the qualifications for it, nor do you deserve it. And I won't discuss what a righteous environment is since you don't think me fit to discuss it. So, I'll only give you 2 choices. Jun Moxie towered in arrogance. The corners of his mouth were curled in a cruel smile. He resembled an eagle looking down on a nest of white rabbits. His expression and posture belied his rogue and uncontrolled lawlessness. In fact, he was brimming with untamed cruelty. The first one. Jun Moxie raised his finger. Each one of you will kneel down and solemnly apologize to me. And then, I'll give each one of you a banner. You will hold them up as you pave the path for my entry. And you'll shout this as I make my way, "The 3rd young master is great. The 3rd young master Jun is noble. And the best. We wholeheartedly welcome 3rd young master Jun to the Tian Xiang city." You will also add your names to these chants as you yell them out. Please subscribe to this channel so that we are more enthusiastic in providing the best video for you. Chapter 448. Cruel Methods. You are dreaming. The 3 scholars snorted. They had obviously anticipated that Jun Xie would put forward some conditions since he had grabbed those women. However, they had never expected such whimsical conditions. How could that be possible? They are our wives. But they still aren't anything more than ornaments of convenience. Don't worry. You have a second option. Jun Xie raised a second finger and lowered his voice. These 3 women are your wives, and I can't put them to any use at present. But let me assure you one thing, you won't want them once they've spent 1 day with these pigs and dogs. So, I will then sell them to the cheapest and filthiest brothels in Tian Xiang. After all, you may not wish to use them again for their bad name. But do you think that the others would mind? Do you think you will like that? And, please don't doubt that I can do it. After all, I have the means to invite these ladies here. So, it also means that I have enough capability to accomplish everything else that I've stated. And, you needn't be worried about the other matter either. You see, the truth is that this young master has a full packet of aphrodisiac in his hands. And, this aphrodisiac works regardless of whether it's a dog or a hog. It can induce full vitality in them. You're evil, Jun Xie. You're doing a very heartless thing. Those 3 are innocent. The entire world is looking at you. And, you still dare to do this? The 3 scholars had gone deathly pale. In fact, they didn't have any color left to their appearance. Why can't I? Why wouldn't I? You're using such despicable means to target an innocent woman. So, why can't this young master do the same? Don't I know that they're innocent? Doesn't this remind you of something? After all, they are guilty of being your wives even if they're innocent. And, you're a group of men who know a woman is innocent. But you're still using such shameless strategies against her. The world is looking at me. But, do you think that they aren't looking at you? Jun Xie taunted and sneered. Do you want to try it? Qin Qiushi didn't wish to abandon his endeavor halfway. But, his prospects would be ruined if the others became weak. Moreover, the Jun family's men seemed fierce. But they were good-natured men. Therefore, he didn't believe that Jun Xie would ruthlessly insult innocent women in public. So, he acted tough. And angrily spoke up. Jun Xie. You're a shameless lowlife. You're lowly enough to use innocent women to coerce us. Your Jun family's name will eternally live on in infamy if you charge into using our beloved wives. Jun Xie replied with an exceptionally cold and cruel laugh. Isn't that my usual conduct? Isn't my usual behavior a household story? Didn't you know about it? This young master is a tyrannical being who doesn't shirk from any crime. You do know this, right? Oh, and then there's the talk of innocence. You even have the guts to talk to me about innocence? Who's more innocent in reality? You start shouting of innocence when it comes to the things that are related to you. In fact, you start shouting about heaven's will and humanity. But, your strategies become extremely contemptible when it comes to other innocent women. In fact, you become ruthless. And you commit all manners of crimes. So, what moral standing do you have to speak of innocence? Feck you. Let me ask you, has your conscience been eaten away by dogs? You stand at the so-called height of morality so that you can needlessly entrap and insult others? Yan Feng and Han Jidong hesitated for a long while at the back. They looked around at the crowd and believed that they had their support. So, they became courageous and shouted in chorus. We stand for the tranquility of the world and the purification of everything under the heavens. Would you dare to do this? Jun Xie's glare became dense, and his voice became extremely cold. tranquility of this world, purification of everything under the heavens. This young master will kill you in broad daylight. How about that? I had previously planned to deal with you after a little while. But I'll come and help you right now since you're so impatient. Wait. Let me look for someone to help you undress your pantaloons. Then, I'll give you some amazing medicines. We'll see how you upright gentlemen's minds don't become a mess after that. We'll leave you a crazed state, but we won't give you a way to solve your problem. However, these hogs and dogs have plenty of elderly female relatives. And they won't let any harm come to you. Do you think that this young master won't dare to do it? Young Master Jun jumped off the horse and walked towards them. He lightly used his horsewhip on Qin Qiushi's head. Then, he stroked his pale cheek with his whip and asked in a soft voice, "You're upright and honorable gentlemen who have a habit of insulting and trampling on other people. So, let me insult you today, okay? Also, allow me to give you the wonderful taste of a man that being bullied." Qin Qiushi subconsciously raised his head with the whip's movement. His expression was one of grief and terror. However, he didn't dare to spit even half a word. After all, he knew of the young master's behavior and past exploits. So, he knew that this man was fully capable of such acts. The Jun family's fate would be meaningless to them if they were to be trifled with in this manner. And that's because they wouldn't be able to see the Jun family's fate unfold. After all, even mere humiliation was enough to make them lose their will to live. These men had previously remained unyielding because of a rotten notion women were like clothes, and men were like the bodies. It wasn't that they hadn't cared about the humiliations Jun Moxie had described he would subject their women to. But this threat wasn't enough to make them surrender to his conditions. After all, they could always replace their wives in case they had been tainted. However, it was their turn now. And it had left their very souls in a genuinely panicky state. However, they weren't aware that Jun Moxie's mind had become gloomy in the face of this scenario. In fact, he had even scolded himself for this miscalculation. After all, he would have never been able to forgive himself if he had done those things to their wives, and had later come to realize that they genuinely hadn't cared about it. Therefore, he instantly changed targets to those people themselves. And this change in tactics yielded great results. Why aren't you speaking now? Weren't you people devoted to righteousness a moment ago? Look at the people behind you, they don't know the truth. But you people know it well. Jun Moxie smiled mischievously. It doesn't matter much though. They will also have to pay back if they act thoughtlessly. So, it doesn't matter whether you understand the truth or not. After all, it's meaningless as far as I'm concerned. That's because the outcome will hurt the ones I care about regardless of your reasons or standpoint. And it won't matter if they're innocent or not if that happens. After all, you will have offended me. And you will bear the consequences if you offend me. I will never spare anyone who offends me. Especially when it comes to hypocrites like yourself. However, those who stand behind you should be glad. After all, I won't implicate their families. But if you don't do what I want you to do, he. Jun Moxie chuckled in a sinister manner. I have a bad reputation. But I'll guarantee that it'll be much better than yours. So, let's try it out if you don't believe me. What was it that you had said the young master wouldn't dare? He wouldn't do it. Strange noises emanated from Qin Qiushi's throat. His eyes shone brightly in fear as he staggered back to stand between Yan Feng and Han Jidong. Then, the three men trembled and started to shudder violently. They couldn't even think at this time forget about daring to fight. Moreover, that previously built-up devotion to righteousness had already been obliterated from their bodies by now. Jun Moxie's conduct was imposing and sinister at this moment. His mannerism was extremely calm, and his words didn't contain any hint of venom. And this had left them to feel that this youngster would easily do what he had said he would. He was like a king who had descended from the heavens, and had then proclaimed the future and fate of his people. These three wouldn't be able to stay in Xiang if they did what he had told them to. They would become the most despised amongst the lowest rungs of society if they shouted the chants he wanted to hear. Even the scholarly power which they had always attached themselves to wouldn't accept the three men. After all, they had stood out in front of their peers. So, they couldn't turn their backs to get out of this predicament even they had wanted to. However, the outcome would be even darker if they didn't do it. And they would be consigned to eternal damnation. That's because this youngster would arrange the greatest of humiliations for them. In fact, this humiliation was something which would never be forgotten throughout the ages. It would be useless even if they died immediately afterwards. However, they obviously didn't wish to die. The three men had no choice in what to do for a moment. They were frightened of their opponent, and were at a loss. However, Jun Moxie continued to look at them in a cold manner while he waited for them to choose. The young master wasn't anxious. He wasn't worried either. Moreover, he didn't care what choice those three hypocrites would make. After all, there wouldn't be a great difference in the outcome. Those three would be made into examples for others to see in either case. The hundreds of people who stood at the back had realized that something wrong with the atmosphere. So, their sights focused on the center now. In fact, some people couldn't prevent themselves from becoming curious. Why have these three women come out? And why are these dogs and hogs present here? What are these for? Moreover, those three men looked so serious a moment ago. So, why do they suddenly look so deathly pale? Why don't they look like a living person anymore? I can do whatever I wish with you, because I have a lot of power. But you have nothing except for a quill in your hand. You have no ability to fight back or resist. A clenched fist is the strongest argument in this world. So, I don't even need to counter your tactics despite your so-called intelligence. I only need to force myself through the piles of your rotten flesh. But, you see, I dislike using violent force. And I merely give people a taste of their own medicine. Basically, I treat a person like they would handle others. Jun Moxie turned the whip very calmly. He then continued in a soft tone, I have very limited time. And my patience is even more limited. So, I hope you make your choices very quickly. Otherwise, I'll make them for you in case you find it difficult to do it yourself. I'll tell you the truth, I don't care what you choose. I only wish to watch the big drama. The three men's complexion turned dead dark when they heard these words. Qin Qiu couldn't bear it anymore. And he started to tremble even more violently. In fact, it was like he was about to throw himself down. Suddenly, a muffled call came from the crowd. Jun Moxie, you're a filthy lowlife. You dared to hold others' wives as hostages? You have fallen extremely low. We won't take to your threats. We would rather have our bodies torn. At least we'll leave this earth pure in that case. The honor of the wives of the three scholars is very important. And can't be tarnished. But personal integrity can't be abandoned. In fact, that's even more important. So, we must never bow our heads to this evil of the Jun family. And we must continue to struggle against this adulterous couple. Moreover, the entire world supports us. Jun Moxie is extremely strong. But can he stand against the entire world's sentiment? These provocative words came out and instantly instigated the subdued crowd. In fact, it even brought out the gleam and resolution in the eyes of the three scholars. Jun Moxie sneered and raised his arm. And a thin yet very long rope suddenly flashed out from it. It then flashed into the crowd with lightning speed like a viper. Then, someone suddenly let out a shrill and mournful scream from the crowd. After all, a huge figure flew into the sky and fell right in front of them. It was a person with a pockmarked face. This man had mixed in the crowd and had taken the opportunity to stir chaos. He had even changed positions after he had spoken those words. So, nobody would have known where the voice had come from. He was certainly very crafty. But how could he ever evade Jun Moxie's now extremely powerful spiritual sense? In fact, he had been locked on as a target even before he had finished speaking. And he obviously couldn't hide once he had been targeted. So, he was quickly caught by the young master. This big man snarled after he fell down. Then, his body got covered in a greenish light as he roared and jumped up to his feet. Jun Moxie smiled cruelly. So, it's a Jade Xian expert. You think you can face me with that cultivation? You truly fecking don't know the difference between life and death. The rope moved again as that life and death phrase sounded, and the big man was resolutely thrown to the ground once again. Then, the rope seemingly dived downwards for a moment. However, it rose to the heavens like a wyvern the next moment. The big man was also taken high up, and it appeared like he was being held there by a hand. In fact, he was left to float in the air like a fluttering flag. It wasn't long when Jun Moxie lengthened a flagpole to go upwards into the sky. And the man was left to look like a salted fish as he hung there with the sharp edge of the flagpole pierced through the nape of his neck. In fact, the edge of the flagpole had pierced through to his skull. The man's body hung straight from the flagpole, by his very skull. But he hadn't died yet. His face seemed full of despair as he faced the scholars and the masses which had gathered there to cause trouble, while his legs continued to cross and twitch. Jun Moxie flew up as lightly as a feather, and stood up on his horse's back. Then, he waved his whip, and the entire sky echoed with a loud snap. His sharp eyes flashed with a thunderbolt. Everyone had felt this change. His eyes then swept over the crowd, and everyone felt as if an oiled steel blade had gone over their faces. The air around their faces had suddenly become extremely cold. They had even started to feel a chilling sensation in their bones. Consequently, everyone had become extremely quiet in a split second. However, this silence only lasted until Yan Feng exclaimed in surprise. That man was. However, he also knew that this wasn't the right moment. So, he instantly closed his mouth. Jun Moxie sneered as he turned his eyes to look at Yan Feng. It felt like he had seen through to the depths of his heart, and his very soul. He then asked in a stern voice, who was he? Jun Moxie's world-defying spiritual pressure was bore down like an explosive tide along with that sound. And whatever little resistance Yan Feng had gathered was left to shatter in its face. He's the Meng family's man. Yan Feng lost his head out of fear, and quickly answered the question. However, he started to vomit foam by the time he was done talking, and fell down in a skewed pose. Even spirit Xian experts would be cautious against such a high-class spiritual attack. So, how could Yan Feng's weak mental strength deal with it? So, it obviously wasn't very shocking that he had fainted. In fact, It would have been normal if his mental state were to be pushed to the brink of idiocy by this attack. Meng family's man? That insignificant Meng family's man had the balls to mess with me? I'll remember this. Jun Moxie laughed heartily. You said that you would rather have your body crushed so that you can leave this world pure. So, I will help you with your wish. I'll crush your body and examine it afterwards. After all, I also wish to see if your purity is still there. Please subscribe to this channel so that we are more enthusiastic in providing the best video for you. Chapter 449. Let me see your purity. Jun Moxie had been restraining his tyranny with difficulty. However, there was suddenly a whistling sound as his body spun and rose high in the sky. Then, a glistened brilliance flashed in the sky. The flame of yellow blood had been unsheathed. Don't, please, spare me. The big man who hung in midair hadn't even finished speaking when he was cut into two halves. Then, there was a squishing sound as his lower back disconnected with his body and fell down. This left a gaping hole in his abdominal cavity. And blood fell down with a huge clamor like a giant sack. His vital organs also dropped downwards along with his intestines. However, the entirety of his organs didn't drop to the ground. After all, his intestines were firmly attached with his body. So, they only hung down from the upper half of his body. His intestines resembled a thin snake. They even issued some steam as they dropped from high up. However, they suddenly stopped short of the ground. Consequently, they were left to resemble a blood-red ribbon that was hung from a flagpole. However, that big man still hadn't died at this time. He screamed as his upper half twitched while remaining hung on the flagpole. Then, he trembled as his eyeballs popped out with a puff sound under the effect of the excessive pain. However, they were also left to hang from his face after that. More blood smeared the ground. Splash! The spectators' faces were splashed with bits of his blood. But each one of them remained standing on their spot in a daze and continued to stare foolishly at this scene. They couldn't dare to make a single move. Their eyeballs had also frozen from extreme fear. Their faces clearly belied their state of extreme horror. These scholars had only read rigid and inanimate books. Could they have ever seen such a bloody scene? These men had heard nothing of the outside world and had only been absorbed in books. In fact, they hadn't even killed a chicken in their homes. However, they were witnessing one of the cruelest and bloodiest scenes in the world at the moment. Even fainting at the sight of such an extremely terrible spectacle would have been a luxury for them. Who would have anticipated this? It had merely seemed as if Jun Moxie was having a huge argument with the three scholars. They clearly had a dispute, but no one had thought that it would end in such a fatal conclusion. There had been no warning when that man had flown into the sky. Then, the back of his head was hung from the flagpole. After that, his lower half had ceased to exist with a slashing sound. His belly had been left to resemble a bottomless fish tank, and his organs were suspended from it with a squishing sound. Jun Moxie had created such a scene of slaughter in broad daylight and public view. This crowd had come here with a lofty attitude. Moreover, they had been carrying the same mindset: the law can't hold a crowd responsible. You may be extremely shameless, Jun Moxie, but even you will never kill someone in front of so many people in broad daylight. Even you wouldn't dare do it. Moreover, you will only be able to run and hide your tail in the face of such great condemnation. And your Jun family's reputation would drown in front of the entire Tian Xiang once you fled. Even one man's spit would be enough to drown you once that time comes. Then, there's the emperor and his power. But no emperor can ignore such turmoil in his populace. An emperor can't neglect the reaction of the masses. So, the imperial court would have no choice but to react to this uproar once it would reach the court. And they would only have two options. The first one would be to send troops to suppress the protest. And the second one would be to make the Jun family apologize in public with a proper explanation. However, how could the many anti-Jun factions compel the emperor to act in their favor? They had waved their banners and had aroused the popular sentiment in their favor. This was the only way they could ask for the Jun family's execution. Therefore, they felt that the Jun family's day of judgment had finally arrived. Their actions had obviously been very extreme. However, none of them had ever expected that the actions taken by Jun Moxie would be even more extreme than theirs. He didn't run or hide. Instead, he faced them head-on. He didn't even deliver a great speech to explain the truth. Instead, he plainly used his power to act in a cruel and bloodthirsty manner. The spectators felt their heart jump through their very throat as they watched this extremely cruel, torturous, and bloody scene. In fact, they felt as if their eyes would pop out. Their vision had suddenly blurred, and they couldn't even hear properly. In fact, they felt like they were experiencing a nightmare. They could only think of one thing: I have to leave this place as quickly as possible. It doesn't matter if the Jun family is innocent or not. I don't care if it's shamed in front of the whole world. It doesn't matter who wins or loses in this struggle. It doesn't even matter how the others will perceive this. I want nothing to do with this. It simply doesn't matter to me anymore. This is so terrible, oh ho. Ha ha ha, you preferred to have your body crushed because you wanted to leave this world whilst you remained pure, right? So, where is that purity now? Your body has been crushed. But where have you left your purity? Why don't I see it? Jun Moxie laughed in a cruel manner. He then sneered at the bloody spectacle he had created. I can only see a pile of pulpy flesh. But I can't see any purity. Jun Moxie laughed loudly as he slowly moved towards a scholar who stood in front of him. Then, he asked him in an extremely gentle tone, I didn't see his purity. Did you see it? You please tell me if you saw it. Okay? That middle-aged scholar had wanted to cram back into the crowd. But his legs had become weak and powerless at the sight of this slaughter. Moreover, there were many people behind him. He had exerted his entire strength, but the people who stood behind him had made no room. In fact, he had felt that he had run into the firmest copper wall, and was left terror-stricken at this realization. And then, Jun Moxie had suddenly walked up to him, and had asked that question in an amiable manner. However, those light words had seemed like explosive thunderclaps to his ears. Jun Moxie's affable appearance had turned to that of a hellish demon in his eyes. In fact, he could even see two long horns above the young master's head. The middle-aged scholar looked at Jun Moxie with despair in his eyes. Then, an ugh sound came from his throat, and he fell down like a loose noodle. He had fainted. Ah, how did it turn out so bad? Isn't this young master's tone mild enough to be termed as friendly? Jun Moxie shook his head with regret. Then, he walked over to another person. He didn't give me a reply. So, you come and see. Is there any purity here? Well, take a look and tell me. I genuinely wish to know. This man stared blankly with bloodshot eyes. His complexion became deathly pale as he subconsciously shook his head in a stiff and dazed manner. Jun Moxie gave a long sigh. So, you didn't see it either. I even thought that I was mistaken at first. After all, he had shouted so loudly that I thought it was true. So, I had believed that I would get to see his purity after his body had been crushed. But this is such a disappointment. The scholar in question reacted the moment Jun Moxie turned and left. He crouched and vomited. In fact, he had vomited in such a violent manner that it seemed if he would puke out his very intestines. I've asked several people, but they didn't see that man's purity. How about you take a look? Jun Moxie slowly walked to the three leading scholars. He then gave a kick to the fainted Yen Feng, and the scholar immediately woke up. Then, Jun Moxie clutched the three of them and forced them to the bloody mess. He then forced their heads towards it. They weren't even half a foot from it when he fiercely asked, "Come. Take a look. Try to find the purity for me. Where is it? I'm very curious." He laughed cruelly as he spoke up in a dark manner. "Purity. Let me take a look at your purity. It's as barren as a desert." The three men were forced to see the blood scene up close since Jun Moxie's fingers were wrapped around their heads. They felt that their brains were being hammered. They felt helpless and wanted to vomit. Moreover, that big man was still hanging overhead and hadn't even died yet. In fact, he was still issuing painful groans. Those three scholars felt they were in hell. They had been gripped with such fear that they tried their hardest to faint. But their nerves were extremely taut, and they were unable to faint. In fact, they couldn't even close their eyes if they wanted to. Instead, they could only open them to the greatest degree and see the cruelest spectacle from up close. Do you see it? Is any purity here? Tell me if you see any. I'm very curious. The soft and amiable voice of Jun Moxie left the three men to shiver like they had malaria. Answer me. You'll end up like him in a moment. After all, I want people to see your purity also. So, tell me, do you see any purity? And, no. The three men looked like a spread-out tripod stand since they had been gripped together by Jun Moxie's hand. And they could only shake their heads in response. So, you still feel pure? Jun Moxie smiled like a demon. No. We don't feel like that. The three men violently shook their heads. Ah well. So, which of those two options will you finally choose? Jun Moxie asked patiently. His voice was extremely gentle. In fact, it was full of magnetism. I choose the first one. The three men tried to outdo each other as they called out. They were frightened to death, and their resolve had been destroyed long ago. What's the point of integrity? What's the point of an official's lifestyle? What's the value of righteousness? Are they more important than my life? Survival is the greatest priority. Very good. I'm very happy with your choice. In fact, I'm very satisfied. Jun Moxie was clearly somewhat gratified as he complimented them. Jun. Third young master. I know who's behind all this. Qin Qiushi raised his head and suddenly called out loudly, "And I'm willing to tell you. I only beg you. I beg you, please spare our lives in return." It seemed that this Qin Qiushi had finally renounced the darkness and had sought the light. It felt as if he had finally mended his ways under the threat of his impending doom. But that youngster was very clever. So, he knew that Jun Moxie wouldn't let them live even after the matter had concluded. Therefore, He felt that this moment was the most fortune for begging, even it meant that he'd lose his honor in the process. Anyway, they probably won't have to see Jun Moxie's face after this day. Spare your lives. I never expected that you'd have the courage to haggle with me at this time. Jun Moxie had never even thought about it. After all, he had never been that magnanimous as a person. A man would have to pay the corresponding costs for his crimes. And a mistake would remain as a mistake even if the said individual were to try remedying his errors later. In fact, it would be completely useless. The person behind this. Jun Moxie snorted. You think I don't know? I know better than you about who is behind this. And I'll think over the aspect of sparing your lives. So, get out of my way for the time being. Jun Moxie's voice was as cold as ice. He waved his hand, and his body started to whirl like a whirlwind. No one could understand what was happening. He was seen holding 3 very strange items in his hand by the time he stopped. They resembled horns, but they were very thin horns. These things were crude, but they had appeared in that world for the first time, the first megaphones. Jun Moxie handed one to each of them, and spoke up in a cold manner. Go on. Open the way for me. Please subscribe to this channel, so that we are more enthusiastic in providing the best video for you. Chapter 450. Bloody events along the entire way, slaughters along the entire way. He looked at the dumbstruck crowd after he finished speaking. These people still hadn't been able to react. So, he chuckled and spoke up darkly. You people still haven't left? Do you also want to be like him? Do you prefer your body being crushed so that you leave this world pure? Anyway, I'm very interested in this purity. Does your body have it? Hee hee. Come. Let me take a look. Everyone recoiled in unison. In fact, many of them have even cried out in pain as they tumbled over each other. I'm saying it for the last and final time, I won't permit this matter to be heard anywhere in Tian Xiang City after today. Jun Moxie coldly swept his gaze over everyone. In fact, his voice even seemed to bringing cold winds along. Your mouth is a part of your body. Whatever you discuss in private is your business. I won't stop it, but I'll look for your purity if I hear of it. In fact, I'll look for the purity of your family till the 9th generation. Get lost. Jun Moxie roared. The crowd was instantly sent into a state of panic. They shouted indiscriminately as they fled in disarray. These nobody scholars were presumptuous enough to think that they could cause trouble for me. Jun Moxie laughed heartily at first. Then, he suddenly flew up and stationed himself on the head of the big man who hung from the flagpole. He then sighed and turned towards the city's gates. Then, he shouted towards the Tian Xiang city. Are you people tired of living? His voice shook the city as it surged through it like a thunderclap. It surged forth in an imposing manner, and carried an unrivaled murderous aura. It seemed like thunder itself had descended and plowed through the city's gates. Jun Moxie stood near the city's gates. The sun shone high, and cast his shadow to slant through the gates. And it suddenly seemed as if the entire city had been shrouded by his shadow. The thousands of wolves frenetically dashed away in order to escape. The momentum of Jun Moxie's aura seemed like a wild and devilish sword as it rushed into the city. There were many people at the back of the crowd. So, they hadn't understood everything at first. However, even they had been awestruck by Jun Moxie's imposing aura. So they also started to roll about in the streets. Fortunately, it was a broad and well-built road. He turned his neck to look at the city's gates in a disdainful manner. He then waved his whip in the air. And a snap sound echoed. Then, he tilted his head and snorted. I'm back in town now. So, I will see how many gossipers are there in Xiang City. Let's see how many men there are willing to die a brave warrior's death. I will also see how many men wish to remain with pure, and how many men are capable of remaining pure. I will check the number. One by one. He bent his legs. Then, the clip-clop of a horse was heard as Jun Moxie shouted and took the lead to pass through the city's gates. Thousands of people saw him enter on his horse, but they remained silent out of fear. The heavy wheels rolled, and the carriage carrying Guan Qinghan and the other two women slowly followed after him. Jun Moxie's words had made everyone's blood boil. But there were still exceptions. And Jun Wu was one such exception. This third master Jun tilted his head and looked at the tall and straight back of Jun Moxie as he rode his horse ahead. He couldn't help but mutter, "Dang it!" He handled this in such a straightforward manner. Even my lifetime worth of influence wouldn't have been able to pull this off. This was too dang excessive. He snorted regretfully. In fact, he felt somewhat sullen as he followed after his nephew. Jun Moxie was emanating a cold and powerful aura as he rode his horse. His face was dark. His back was straight. His lips were pursed. And his sword-like eyebrows had somewhat shot up. In fact, it seemed like he stirred a panicked uproar wherever he looked. Then, he suddenly heard someone speak in a very low voice. I also don't know why he looks like that. He commits adultery with his sister-in-law. And yet, he arrives here with such a haughty expression. He's shameless. Jun Moxie's body remained motionless as he rode on his horse. But there was a streak of silver light in his sleeves. Then, there was a bang sound, and a very thin man was snatched up from the crowd. The young master was even more straightforward this time around. He even saved himself the interrogation. The young master merely hung that man from the flagpole. There was a bloody cavity in that man's throat, while the expression of disdain still hadn't left his face. This man's body had flashed with a gold light before it had gotten annihilated. So, it was evident that he was also a Xian expert who was hiding in the crowd to create trouble. However, he had been luckier since he was already breathing his lasts when he was swung in the air. There was a cry of alarm, and the entire crowd began to pull back when they saw this. They looked at Jun Moxie with expressions of terror. Is this boy mad? Will he genuinely do what he said he would? Will he murder so blatantly? Several men suddenly found themselves drenched in cold sweat at the edge of the crowd. They did their best to push back and nearly twisted their legs in their attempts to escape. But how could they escape from the huge power net of Jun Moxie's spirit sense? Jun Moxie's glare remained cold as a golden light quickly flashed in his hands. And the 7 or 8 people who had broken into a run fell to the ground. Each of their backs had a small and bloody hole in them. The golden throwing knives flickered on their backs as their bodies got pasted to the road. The golden knives obviously shone very brightly under the effect of the sunlight. Several members of the Heaven Destroyers team quickly ran forth, picked up the golden knives, and respectfully returned them to Jun Moxie. Jun Moxie's eyes remained expressionless as he took the 8 knives. Then, he gave them a swirl, and they suddenly and mysteriously disappeared with the flickering of a golden light. He then calmly continued to move forward. His dark and handsome face only had one thing written over it: I've said this once, and I won't repeat it. I'll kill you if you dare to open your mouth. So, you open your mouth, and I will kill you. Simply. Plainly. No exceptions. The three scholars were shouting themselves hoarse up ahead. They were also clutching those simple yet special megaphones. In fact, their slogans sounded like crying. The third young Master Jun is great. The third young Master Jun is noble. He's the best man in the world. He's a very good man. He's a very benevolent man. We three scholars welcome him to Tian Xiang. They continued to shout out these slogans in a very mechanical manner. In fact, it seemed as if they didn't even know what they were shouting about. However, their faces were overflowed with tears, and there was endless humiliation written on them. But they still didn't dare to make any thoughtless moves. And that was because the shadow of death had still enveloped them from above. Their voices had become hoarse, and their throats had become raw. However, they still hadn't dared to stop. And that's because their sole aim was to survive. What difference does a little suffering make? I need to survive. Suddenly, 30-40 scholars of the Wenxing Institute arrived in front of them. However, they stood shocked as one of them asked, "Brother Han? Brother Yen? Brother Qin? What are you doing? Are you mad? You're opening a path for this lowlife." What reply could Qin Qiushi and the others dare to give? They could only give hints and meaningful looks before they quickly walked on. But that scholar didn't understand the meaning hidden in those expressions. So, his heart filled with righteous indignation as he angrily shouted, "Jun Moxie! Didn't your father teach you shame? You've committed adultery with your sister-in-law. That's such an immoral thing. But you still insult my Tian Xiang scholars? You've gone too far." Many people who stood behind him had already seen that bloody scene. So, they had understood the situation. Therefore, many of them stepped forward to pull him back. However, that youngster stubbornly continued to shout, "Such a shameless man can't exist in the same world as this Sherwin Chong." Jun Moxie looked over that person very coldly. His eyebrows moved very slightly as he replied in a faint voice, "Die." A sword light spun forth. It didn't seem to care who its victim was as it cut through every scholar that blocked its path. The young scholar screamed in disbelief when he saw this. Then, he also fell into a pool of blood. Jun Moxie sighed as his horse passed by that scholar's body. He then softly said, "Perhaps you genuinely had guts. Perhaps you didn't wish to trouble me. But even that's useless. And it doesn't mean that I won't kill you. After all, how would people believe me if I didn't follow through on what I've said? You didn't believe it. And I regret that. In fact, I must remember to put forth 2 conditions from next time onwards." Jun Moxie looked calm as he prodded his horse forward. He didn't even look back. But his soft voice could still be heard. "First, you need to have strength to deal with every eventuality. Second, you need to have a strong backing so that others don't provoke you. You must also have unwavering courage and determination. Only then can you have enough power to target others. But never try to become a hero otherwise. You may have bones of iron. But I see you as nothing but wretched creatures that I have to kill. Moreover, your death won't amount to any injustice." That scholar had been cut in half. But he hadn't left the world yet. Tears flowed from his eyes as he closed them. He muttered as he inched closer to death's door, "Master, you were wrong." Jun Moxie pulled a slight face dozens of meters away. "Master. Mei Gao Jie. Kong Ling Yang." He suddenly waved his whip and struck the 3 scholars who were walking ahead. Those three screamed in pain and turned around to face Jun Moxie. He gestured towards the flagpole as he quietly said, "You'll shout louder now. We'll pass the gates very soon. And you'll shout this. Mei Gao Jia is a turtle. Kong Ling Yang is a pimp. Meng family is a den of bastards when we pass from there. You don't want to die, right? Do this, and I'll let you live." The three people nearly collapsed when they heard this. How could they say something like this in the backdrop of this era's social values? After all, one's teacher held the highest status in society. A teacher-disciple wasn't a part of the 5 cardinal relationships. However, the teacher was placed in the highest of regards. Moreover, Mei Gao Jia and Kong Ling Yang were their teachers. We won't have to care about drowning the Jun family is saliva of shame if we say this. After all, we will have been drowned in it before it would even reach the Jun family. Moreover, the Meng family is extremely powerful and influential. You may not have to worry about them, Jun Moxie. After all, you're very powerful. But what about us? Jun Wu-yi arrived close to his nephew at once. He then whispered, "This is a bit too much. Moxie. Be careful about meddling with the court." Too much. Jun Moxie looked at him in a baffled manner. "Third uncle, you're not stupid, right? Don't tell me that we still care about the court. Third uncle must never forget our current identity. We're on the same level as the Silver Blizzard City. Why should we care about the insignificant imperial family?" This story will be continued to chapter 451. For those of you who are not subscribed yet, please subscribe. The interesting and best stories will be updated. See you again in the next episode.